And thanks again for joining us for today's IFR Quiz Hour webinar. We're glad to have you with us. This is part of Sporty's IFR month, where we celebrate the fun and challenge and rewards of instrument flying. We've done a number of these webinars over the last month, and this one is a little bit of a capstone. We're going to test your knowledge on some different topics in aviation. And so let me give you a quick overview. First of all, who am I? I'm John Zimmerman. I'll be your host and presenter today. I'm the president of Sporty's. I get to work right there in the Claremont County Airport every day. It's a heck of a lot of fun getting to work on the airport. And I'm also an ATP and an instrument ground instructor. So I'm going to come at this today from the standpoint of really a pilot more than anything. Sure, the instrument ground instructor part will get a little nitty gritty on a few of these things, but I'm mostly presenting to you as a pilot who's interested in how this works. All right, so you're going to see 10 questions throughout this webinar today. 5 of them are from the knowledge test. 5 of them are the written test, as some of us still call it. 5 of them are from the oral exam. And so these are going to be a little different, a little bit more open-ended. I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer these. The written ones are going to be in a quiz form in the GoToWebinar software. The oral ones you're going to answer to yourself, and then we'll walk through them. So you can vote on screen for those written ones, and then we'll discuss each question. And really, this is what it's all about. The discussion of these questions is what we care about. That's where the learning happens. So don't get too worried about what you get right, what you get wrong. As I said, as we talk about the questions and the answers, it'll work out just fine. You'll notice a couple of handouts here. I'll mention those as those come up, but you can access those from the materials button in the GoToWebinar software there. So if you see the little paper clip looking thing, that's your materials. Those will come at the end, so don't worry, you don't need those right now. And with that, let's dive in. Let's start with the knowledge test. Here are 5 questions you very well might see if you go to take the instrument rating airplane knowledge test. First, what night operations are authorized between the approach end of the runway and the threshold lights? And you can see the diagram there, so take a good look at that. A, taxi and takeoff towards the threshold. B, no operations short of the threshold. Or C, only taxi short of the threshold. Looks like the overwhelming winner here is A, taxi and takeoff towards the threshold. That's 72% of you voted for that one. Second place was C, only taxi short of the threshold. Well, you are correct. Good job, everybody. A is the correct answer. Taxi and takeoff towards the threshold. Only taxi short of the threshold. Pretty good distractor there. Some of you bid on that one, but A is the answer. So why do we care? Let's do a quick review of runway markings, because we assume when we fly IFR that we're going to shoot an approach, and at the bottom of that approach is going to be the beautiful runway. And we did it, and we found our way out of the clouds, but it's not over until we land. And sometimes there's a moment of almost panic when you see the runway and where actually is the runway? Which part's the runway? So to review, on the left, we have what's often called a blast pad, those chevrons. There's really nothing there. You should never be on that surface. That is an overrun. That is the blast pad, as it's alluded to. That is not for your airplane on it. The one in the middle, you notice there's a subtle difference there. It's still yellow, but there's a center line there. We can taxi on that, but because it's yellow, there's no takeoff or landing. That's just taxi. The one on the right, we have white and arrows pointing towards a threshold. That one we can taxi and take off on, but not land on. Maybe that's review for some of you, but I always like to go through the details because especially as you get to bigger airports, that can be a little confusing. So here's the way I remember it. In general, yellow means a taxiway. So if you see yellow, even if it's in line with the runway, yellow means taxi, not runway, not takeoff and landing. White means runway. If it has a centerline stripe, you can probably use it. It's probably either a taxiway or a runway. If there's no centerline like you see here with the chevrons, that means it's an overrun or a blast pad. So there are finer points to this and some distinctions, but in general, yellow taxiway, white runway. Now at night, you can't see all of those, so we depend on the lights to help us there. So when it comes to night, green is your friend here. Not surprisingly, these colors are not picked at random. You can see in the example here on the screen, the green row across the threshold. That is your signal. That's where we can land. So if you break out at the bottom of that approach, you can see here there's a blast pad and a displaced threshold. The white leads you to the green. The red says don't land here. you might be able to taxi there, but at the bottom of the approach, look for those green lights. That is the runway threshold. That is your friend. And at night, really, that's what you're looking for. When we talk about seeing the runway environment and being able to continue below minimums for landing, that green threshold line is about the best thing there is. All right, so there's a warm-up for you on runway lights. Let's go to question 2. We're going to talk about icing. So approaching your destination, you pick up a ½ inch of rime ice in your descent through a cloud layer. You're now in the clear with unlimited visibility and a temperature of 35 degrees Fahrenheit. You decide to A, not change your normal landing speed, B, approach with a slightly slower landing speed, C, approach with a slightly faster landing speed. All right, overwhelming 99% went with option C, approach with a slightly faster landing speed. Well, did not fool anybody at all there. And good for you. That is the correct answer. C, approach with a slightly faster landing speed. A little bit of a tried to trick you up there that, well, we already broke out. We're in the clear. The temperature's above freezing, so maybe we don't need to worry about that ice anymore. But you all did not bite on that, so good job. This is all to tee up the conversation about icing. And my main takeaway here is that a little ice can make a big difference, and especially on landing. I would direct your attention to a great article on Airfax, a website we do here at Sporty's. And it's called In-Flight Icing's Hidden Threat, the Landing Flare, written by Steve Green, very experienced airline pilot and icing researcher. I'll quote just a little piece here that I think is relevant. And he says, what may appear to the pilot as a manageable drag rise due to a very thin layer of rime or residual ice following boot operation suddenly becomes an enormous drag rise during the flare maneuver as the angle of attack is increased. The point here is you may be trucking along just fine with some ice on the airframe, but when you go to flare on landing, you can automatically stall that airplane at a much higher airspeed than you might be expecting. So everything can be working just fine until you're 10 feet off the runway. And when you go to flare, you might find the landing happens a lot faster. And maybe there's no damage to the airplane, but it could be a pretty rude awakening when those wheels hit the runway. The reason is the increase in drag is not linear. So you see two curves here, and this is a little technical, but it's pretty easy to understand. We have one with a clean airfoil, one with airfoil with ice on it. And basically what we're showing here is drag as angle of attack increases. And you can see the airfoil with ice on it, the drag goes from not much to a lot almost instantly. So whatever we're used to in a normal landing flare or even a stall is not the same when we have ice on the wing. And that just reinforces that we do need to add some speed if we still have ice on the airframe. And this goes for an unprotected airplane or in a protected airplane if there's still ice on the airframe, maybe the boots didn't get it all. Do not expect a normal drag coefficient when you go to flare during that landing. So when ice is on the airplane, even if you have boots or TKS on your airplane, generally a good idea to leave the flaps up, or if they're partially down, don't put them any further down. Fly at a faster approach speed. And give yourself a longer runway. You don't need to add 25 knots, but if you're going to be adding some speed in some airplanes, it can be 5, 10, 15 knots. Give yourself more to work with. Do not find yourself landing on a 3,000-foot runway with flaps up and a faster approach speed. If you run the math on some airplanes that have been certified even for flight into known icing conditions, more recently since the famous Roselawn crash in the 90s, they have very explicit landing performance data with ice on the airframe. And this can increase the required landing distance 50% or more. So if you're in one of these situations, go to the longer runway, maybe go to the next airport over with the longer runway if you have to, and give yourself more to work with. You see a horrible picture of a Saab 340 here with ice all over the place. It does not have to look that bad to affect performance. So sometimes you think about icing of that dark and stormy night where it looks like that. It does not have to be that bad. So give yourself some outs. All right, question 3. A little bit of regulation work here. Before beginning any flight under IFR, the pilot in command must become familiar with all available information concerning that flight, including A, all instrument approaches at the destination, B, an alternate airport and adequate takeoff and landing performance at the destination airport, or C, the runway lengths at airports of intended use and the aircraft's takeoff and landing data. All right, most of you went with C, runway lengths at the airports of in takeoff and landing data. 18% of you went for B, 3% went for A. So mostly all in agreement here. And again, you guys are on your game today. That is correct. C, the runway lengths at airports of intended use and the aircraft's takeoff and landing data. A few of you went for B, which is what I was trying to trick you with, which is, hey, we're talking IFR. Don't I have to pick an alternate every time? Or how about A? Don't I have to brief the approaches? And from a regulatory standpoint, the answer is no. And I bring this up for two reasons. One is what you see here on the screen, accidents by phase of flight. Maybe there's a hint here. I don't know that this is the FAA's approach here, but I take it as a subtle suggestion of, hey, for all the challenges of IFR flying, the places that pilots still bend airplanes is on landing and takeoff. And so it's easy to overlook that on an IFR flight when we're thinking about procedures and weather and ATC and all kinds of other things, but the takeoff and landing is still the critical phase of flight there. Don't forget to do your homework on the runways you're using and your takeoff and landing data. What's your weight and balance? How much runway distance do you need? Consider on a wet runway, maybe that matters, especially in higher performance airplanes, that can make a difference. So number one, don't overlook that. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't look at approaches or departures before an IFR flight? I mean, no way. I mean, absolutely not. Just because the regulations say one thing does not mean that's what makes a good pre-flight briefing. So as a reminder, if you want to go look at the chapter and verse, FAR 91-103 pre-flight action, this talks about what every pilot in command should do. And you can read about what you need there. I honestly don't think that's that important. I think the key part is basically the standard you have to hit for pre-flight action from a regulation standpoint is incredibly low. So what really matters is you developing your own pre-flight flow. What do you need to look at? Weight and balance data, runway performance data, weather, pilot competency, aircraft. There's a lot to look at. There's a lot to study, but don't get bogged down in what the FAA wants. Make it a flow that works for you. So experiment with it, talk to other pilots, talk to a flight instructor, but I think every pilot needs to have almost an automatic habit of here's how I brief a flight. Maybe here's how I brief it 2 days before, 1 day before I dig in deeper, and the day of I look at a few last minute things. That's really what counts, not what FAR 91 says here. All right, question 4. An instrument departure procedure requires a minimum climb rate of 210 feet per nautical mile to 8,000 feet. If you climb with a ground speed of 140 knots, what is the required rate of climb in feet per minute? A, 490, B, 450, C, 210. A little bit of math here, but you can probably estimate it if you need to. All right, we've got a little bit of a split decision here, almost 50-50 between A and B. Everybody felt like it's somewhere in the 400-ish range, but 50% went with A, 46% B, 4% with C. So let's reveal the right answer, and that is A, 490 feet. So very well done, everybody. Most of you got it, although kind of a bare majority got that. The reason I add this question is that to me, our brains think in feet per minute, not feet per mile. Pilots, we know about what climb rate we can get in feet per minute when we take off. We know descent rates we have to maintain in feet per minute when we shoot an approach. At least my brain does not think in feet per nautical mile. So anytime I see that on a departure procedure, I really want to think about it and make sure I've run at least some rough math to see if I can do it. Lots of different ways to do it. You can obviously use an E6B calculator. You can use an app. You can do math with a scratch pad. Don't forget, in the front of the Terminal Procedures publication, the approach plate book, you've got this climb descent table where you can do climb in feet per nautical mile down the left side and ground speed on the right, work across there. So this is your friend. When in a pinch, this should be either in your paper charts or in your EFB app. You can find that. I think even better is to know some round numbers for your airplane. So what's normal? You know, if you fly a 172, what's normal for you? What can you do? If you fly a single engine turboprop, what's normal? That's the key takeaway to me. But I think in general, anything over 400 feet per nautical mile should probably get your, that depends on the airplane, but in general, you're starting to get at most ground speeds. And remember, this is ground speed that's based on. Anything over 400 feet per nautical mile can start to get pretty steep, and you should at least go to the math and make sure you're doing what you want to do. Here's an extreme example, which many of you may know, which is Aspen, Pitkin County Airport in Aspen, Colorado. This is the Aspen 7 departure. This is not your everyday snoozer of a departure. And if you look down there carefully at the takeoff minimums, you will notice that runway 33, the takeoff minimums are 401, with minimum obstacle climb of 650 feet per nautical mile to 13,000. Well, if you do the math at a typical ground speed, it can easily be 1,600 feet per minute, and you've got to maintain that all the way to 13,000 feet. That could be a mighty big stretch in a lot of airplanes, especially piston airplanes. So certainly not every airplane is Aspen, but that's an extreme example of where this really comes into play, and it's not to be overlooked. I mean, there's lots of hints here. Obviously, you're in the mountains. You'll notice the takeoff minimums runway 15 NA, terrain. I mean, that's a good hint that there's some big rocks around here. And so when you look at 3.3 and see 650 feet per nautical mile, and then ATC climb of 840 feet per nautical mile of 16,000 feet, do not just blindly accept that if your airplane can't do it, because that could be some pretty great performance if you're trying to coax that out of a Cherokee or a 182. All right, question 5. This will be our last written test question, and then we'll move on to the oral exam part. So number 5, when is radar service terminated during a visual approach? A, immediately upon acceptance of the approach by the pilot. B, when ATC advises radar service terminated, resume on navigation. Or C, automatically when ATC instructs the pilot to contact the tower. All right, another little bit split decision here. 55% went with B, when ATC advises radar service terminated. 35% went with C, automatically when ATC instructs you to contact tower, and 10% with A, immediately upon acceptance of the approach. Yeah, this is a little bit of a tricky one, I think. Maybe something you haven't thought about before. I know I haven't thought about it a whole lot, but the correct answer is C, automatically when ATC instructs the pilot to contact the tower. So this happens a lot. In my experience, probably 80% of my IFR flights end in a visual approach. And so you don't think about this much, but here's the actual quote from the AIM here. Radar service is automatically terminated without advising the pilot when the aircraft is instructed to change to the advisory frequency. So when they say cleared for the visual contact tower or cleared for the visual, go to Unicom, contact me on the mist, that's it. At that point, you are on your own. Avoiding traffic, obstacles, and weather is up to you. So it's not meant to scare you, but just to remind you that when you're cleared for the visual and they kick you over to tower, ATC is basically out of the game from the standpoint of obstacles, traffic, weather. They're going to be helpful if there's a tower, certainly, but it's pretty much on you. You've accepted that responsibility. So a couple reminders here when we talk about a visual approach. It can't just be issued randomly. Pilot must have either the airport or the preceding aircraft in sight that you're following. It must be authorized by ATC. You can't go do it on your own. And then finally, airport must have a ceiling of at least 1,000 feet and 3 miles visibility. This one is, I think, often forgotten by pilots. Seems just obvious that if I have the runway, I can land there, but technically, that's what the book says. AIM, Chapter 5, Section 4, Part 23 is where you want to go if you want to read up on this. And there's a couple parts here I think are interesting. One is a reminder, visual approaches are an IFR procedure conducted under IFR in visual meteorological conditions. So yes, it's a visual approach, but you are still IFR. If you fly in a visual approach to Atlanta Hartsfield Airport, you are absolutely still on an IFR procedure, and you are conducting it under instrument flight rules, talking to the tower. It's just not a charted procedure, and you're maintaining your visual reference to the airport, but still an IFR procedure. The second part is when conducting visual approaches, pilots are encouraged to use other available navigation aids to assist in positive lateral and vertical alignment with the runway. Maybe obvious, but just because you're doing the visual doesn't mean you can't load up something in your GPS. Many newer ones have a visual approach feature you can load. Even without that, you may want to load up the backup RNAV approach or ILS. Certainly does not hurt to have something there to check and make sure you're flying the right approach to the right runway, especially at night. Get cleared for the visual approach, pretty much automatically I'm going to be putting something in the GPS so I have some CDI or HSI that I can look at and make sure I am lined up with the correct runway, or frankly, even the runway. Sometimes taxiways, roads, you never know, can look like it. So just because you think you have the runway in sight, it doesn't hurt to back it up. All right, that was the written part of it. Let's talk about the oral exam. So we're going to shift modes a little bit here. Let's assume you've passed the knowledge test and you're sitting down with the examiner now. This is before we go flying some topics. These are a little more open-ended, so this won't be quiz style. There's no ABC here, correct answer. I'm going to pose some questions, ask you to think about it a little bit, and then we'll talk through the answers as you might with the examiner on check ride day. So first, question 6, how much flight time and what type of flight time must a person who applies for an instrument airplane rating have logged? So this is often the first thing that happens. You sit down with the examiner and they'll say, hey, let's make sure you can even be here. Let's make sure you're qualified. So what do you need to apply for that instrument rating and take the check ride? Well, you may not have all these right at hand, but let's review them. 50 hours of pilot and command cross-country time, 40 hours of instrument time, including 15 hours of dual. There's some footnotes in there you want to pay attention to. You need to have 3 hours within 2 months of the check ride, which I always point out because right now examiners are pretty overbooked, and sometimes you can schedule your check ride months in advance of when it actually happens. Well, make sure you get 3 hours within 2 months of it. You want to be current going into it. And then there's that long cross country, 250 miles total distance, 3 different kinds of approaches. So those are the highlights there, but let's dive into a couple details here. Number one, 6165, that's the FAR if you want to go look at every last detail of it. 40 hours of instrument time, well, what does that mean? What about simulators? These are increasingly common at flight schools. Can't I use a simulator for some of this? And the answer is yes, but you can use a simulator. Up to 10 hours of instrument time can be credited in a basic aviation training device or a BATD, 20 hours in an AATD, an advanced aviation training device. But remember, these are typically larger, more expensive, quote unquote, approved devices that you'll find in a flight school. This is not a flight simulator you've got at your house, most likely. I cannot just run Microsoft Flight Sim with a Honeycomb Alpha yoke and log time. These have to have a letter of authorization. They're usually approved to be used with an instructor and for certain maneuvers. So it's not just a blanket, get in the sim and use it. It needs to be an approved sim in the approved use. So I think that's important because sims are great. I think sims are a fantastic way to improve your instrument skills and prepare for a check ride. I absolutely think even the most basic home sim has tremendous value for an instrument student. However, that is mostly about the time you save, not the time you log. And when we talk about logging time, there are very specific requirements, and it typically needs to be an approved device like one of these. Another note, on the 50 hours of PIC cross country, that's not required if you're training in a Part 141 school, which are reasonably popular. I don't know, maybe half the flight schools out there these days are 141. These are so-called FAA approved schools that use an approved training course outline. Interesting point on the 3 different kinds of approaches here when we talk about the long cross country. There's been some misunderstandings there through the years. There's been different legal interpretations. The most current one, the FAA rescinded in 2022 this CARTI memo. It used to be fairly strict. Now I think it's fair to say you have a lot more latitude. So different approaches means different types of minimums, basically. It's not navigation systems. So you do not have to go shoot an NDB approach, an ILS approach, and an RNAV approach. You basically have to use different minimum lines on the approach plate. So for example, a localizer and an ILS are different approaches. An RNAV that you shoot to an LPV is different from one you shoot to an LNAV with an MDA. So we could go do that cross country and shoot an ILS and an LNAV and an LPV, and we use the GPS unit for basically all of them. The ILS, obviously the radio needs to be primary, but that counts. So don't get too caught up in the minutia there. In general, if you're using different minimum lines on the approach plate, you're going to satisfy the requirement for different approaches. The other thing I'd point out here is if you are actually going for a check ride, have these key areas tabbed in your logbook. The examiner is almost certainly going to ask for these, and you'll save time and look more professional if you show up prepared and can say, bam, here's my 50 hours PIC cross country. Here is my long cross country, 250 nautical miles. It really makes a good first impression if you've done your homework on that. All right, question 7. Under what conditions are you required to initiate a missed approach? Sounds like a fairly simple question, but give that some thought here and then we'll talk through it. All right, the AIM once again is your best friend here. 555. There's a couple things that are obvious here and maybe a couple that aren't as obvious. Number one is what we all think of. We arrive at the missed approach point without proper visual reference. So you descend to MDA and that LNAV approach and you level out and you're looking and you're looking and you're looking and you do not see the lights or the runway environment. Well, that's a missed approach. Off we go, hit the power. Again, don't overthink it here, but as I mentioned in that very first question, what are we looking for when we say the runway environment? Obviously, the runway itself, the numbers, if you see, runway 22 on the pavement for runway 22, those lights are a great one. That green threshold light's a good thing to look for. Just because you see some part of the airport environment is probably not enough for you to safely continue. So that's the obvious one. The second one I think is maybe the most important. You should go missed anytime a safe approach and landing is not possible, whether you have the runway or not. Maybe the ceiling was 1,000 feet and the visibility is 10 miles. But if you flub the approach and you're way too high and way too fast, and you're going to have to do an extreme slip to slam it on the runway, that is a missed approach. Automatically, you need to go around. It's not just about weather. So keep that in mind for sure. And that is encoded in the regulations there. You need to be able to be in a position to make a safe landing from that instrument approach. The third one there, anytime ATC does it. So you could be on short final and a vehicle on the ground goes into the runway and they say go around. You're going to do a missed approach because of ATC. And then fourth, and maybe rarely, but importantly here, if visual reference is lost while circling to land. So if you're doing a circle approach, which we don't do a lot of these days, we have RNAV approaches to a lot of runways, but some airports, there's no other option than a circle to land. If we are circling, say we're on left downwind, modified left downwind, and an unfortunate piece of scud or cloud gets in our way and we lose sight of the runway, we need to go missed right then. Do not scud run around the pattern trying to find the runway again. That is a recipe for disaster. How about some other reasons? How about course deviations? What if I'm just flying a terrible approach? That one, you've got some leeway, but basically if positive navigation is in doubt, and I would say 3/4 or more CDI deflections, great standard there, go missed. Because if that CDI gets fully pegged, you don't know if you're a half mile off or 7 miles off. So if it's in doubt, go missed. In that case, let's say we do have to go missed and we're well before the missed approach point. This is an area that I've seen some check ride busts on. What if I go missed and I'm still 5 miles from the missed approach point or from the runway? Continue to fly the approach course at or above MDA. So climb for sure, get some space between you and the hills, but do not make a turn. Because if you're still well short of the missed approach point, remember, everything on that missed approach procedure is predicated on you starting the missed at the missed approach point. So don't go making anything up if you go missed early. Keep flying that approach course. Get the needle centered if you can, but definitely start climbing. And then how about that missed approach from a visual approach? We talked about visuals earlier. That is an instrument procedure. Well, the answer here is you're kind of going to make it up, unfortunately. There is no published procedure for a visual. You typically will not get told one from ATC when they clear you for the visual. I don't think I've ever heard cleared for the visual. If you go missed, fly this heading and altitude. So the answer is basically go around, roughly line up with runway heading is going to be safe. Get to pattern altitude. You want to get altitude number one, and you want to start talking. So from that missed approach, sort of related to the visual here, and this is in the Instrument Flying Handbook, which is actually a pretty good read on this topic. What if I am on that circling approach, which is essentially a kind of a visual approach at that point, and I lose sight of the runway? What do I do then? Well, critical point here is climbing turn towards the runway. So you want to get to that missed approach procedure, or the missed approach course, but you want to climb to the airport. Get some altitude and turn over that airport, because a lot of times your protected area around the airport on a circling approach is not much, and you'd much rather be over the airport figuring it out than over some random hill somewhere trying to figure it out. So climbing turn toward the landing runway, get over the airport, and that is a great time to communicate. Definitely aviate, navigate first, but then communicate. You're going to need to talk to tower or approach and get a new plan. Missed approaches, very important. We don't do a ton of them. We tend to practice them, and in real life, most of our approaches end up successful. So if you haven't practiced a real missed approach in a while, I highly recommend it. I had to do one somewhat recently in bad weather, and it worked out fine, but I'll admit I was not really current on doing missed approaches because we just don't do them that often. All right, number 8, we would, of course, not have an IFR quiz hour without talking about lost communications. This is everybody's favorite. And it's a little academic, but I do think it's actually important because this can and does happen. So what are the lost communication procedures when flying under IFR? We're buzzing along and nobody's home on the radio. What do we do? Well, there's multiple steps here we'll walk through. And again, I'll give you the reference. You can go read it if you want in the AIM 641. The easiest answer here is if you're in VFR or if you're close to VFR, get VFR and land, because all the other things here are great, but if you are in VFR, do not overthink it. Land at that airport and solve the problem on the ground, not in the air. I think everybody knows that, but it's always worth reiterating, because usually this conversation quickly gets into all the minutia of altitudes and routes and everything. But a lot of our IFR flying happens in visual meteorological conditions. So if you're VMC, go land. But of course, for the purposes of this check ride, we're going to assume we're IFR. It's 200.5 everywhere. So we want to start with route. What route should I fly? Well, the easiest one is the last one assigned in an ATC clearance. So if we are flying along an airway towards a VOR and we are cleared to our destination via that route, keep flying that. If you had a radar vector, if ATC told you turn left heading 210 vectors, final approach, runway 22 approach, well, fly that vector to the fix. They told you what to expect, and basically the whole reason they tell you what the purpose of their vector is for this lost comm scenario. So you'll almost always hear that if ATC is doing their job, they won't just randomly give you a vector. They'll give you a vector and a reason for it. That's why. If there is no route assigned, go by the route that ATC has advised. And as a catch-all, if nothing's assigned, we're really out there on our own, go by the route filed in the flight plan. That's what ATC is going to be expecting. That's probably the path they're going to clear for you. And lacking all other information, they'll go to that and say, well, he filed this, so let's clear that airspace and assume he's going to go fly that route to that approach to that airport. Altitude. So if we're IFR, the highest of the following, again, always better to be too high than too low here. The highest of the following three options. The altitude assigned in the last clearance. So if ATC said climb, maintain 6,000, and you're on the way up to that, keep climbing, maintain 6,000. However, if the minimum altitude for IFR operations is higher than that, well, we want to go even higher. Or if the altitude or flight level ATC has advised may be expected. So this is, again, in the standard clearance. You'll often get cleared on departure, climb, maintain 2,500, expect 6,000 10 minutes after departure. That's what that's there for. They don't want you to be buzzing along at 2,500 feet forever. That expected means if you take off and lose communications, you can expect to climb at that altitude, so you can in the case of lost comms. A couple things to look at on charts. Our old friend, the low altitude en route chart. So how do we find that altitude? Maybe I was cleared to 4,000, but is that actually the highest of those three? Well, here I've circled some Victor Airways. You can see the altitudes there. For example, Victor 14, the altitude above it there, 3,700. Victor 114 down there, 3,700. So if you're flying the airway, that's your answer. But then don't forget about the Oroka altitudes. Those are those beige ones I have circled here on this slide. So a lot of times these days we're not flying on airways, especially outside the Northeast or Florida. So if we're off route going direct destination, those beige numbers are your friend. Those are the ones you're looking for. So that's the legal part of it. And that's what obviously the examiner on a check ride would ask for. But I just want to focus on a couple practically here. Check your equipment, because about 90% of the time, I would say lost comm is not actually the radio smoked up, especially with modern radios these days. It's that you, the pilot, have done something wrong. We've all been there. You're on COM 2 instead of COM 1. You have the volume turned down. You have the intercom selected on the wrong one. You have the headsets unplugged. There's just all kinds of little things that can go wrong. So when in doubt, be humble and assume you messed it up, because you may be able to get ATC back in a hurry. And so check your frequency. You can check that on, your iPad app for sure. Check the intercom, check the volume. Sounds simple. I've done it countless times. It can and will happen to you. Monitor 121.5. So it's possible you flew out of range of the frequency you were on and ATC forgot to give you a frequency change. In that case, monitor 121.5. They will probably come on there and try to reach you. They'll call out November 12345, Cincinnati approach on guard. If you hear me, contact me on this frequency. That is exactly why if you have a COM 2, you should pretty much always have 121.5 dialed in on COM 2 and have that in the background. I do not fly cross country without that in the background. I'm talking ATC on COM 1, and I've got 121.5. I've got guard frequency in COM 2. It's for exactly that reason. If you don't hear them asking for you, you can try to reach another pilot, because many pilots are flying along monitoring that. So you can say, hey, anybody on guard, hear me. I lost ATC. Can you help me find a frequency? This happens all the time. Works pretty well. The biggest point here is take the conservative approach. This is especially true on altitude. If you're not sure, man, should I go to 4,000 or 6,000? Don't overthink it. Go to 6,000. Take the conservative approach on that. Don't worry about ATC. If they really think you've lost comms, they're going to probably clear a fair amount of airspace for you. And the number one rule for you is to be conservative, get altitude, and don't try to be a hero. Don't try to get too creative here. So I do have a quick pop quiz here because, of course, there's one other part. It lost comms, which is maybe the radio is not working, but maybe the transponder is. So I'm going to pop up one more quiz here. What is the appropriate squawk code for lost communications? 7500, 7600, 7700. All right, well done. Didn't fool many of you. 87% went with B, 7600, 7% A, 6% C. Well, you're correct, 7600. So 7500 is a reminder, that's hijacking. That's probably not one you want to do. It'll get you attention in the ATC control room, but probably not what you want. 7600 is lost communications. 7700 is not necessarily wrong. That's just general emergency. So if you squawk 7700, it's nothing wrong with that. That's going to light up the controller screen and they're going to clear the airspace. But 7600 is the correct answer. All right, two more. We're going to walk through some kind of briefing stuff here. So here's one that happens a lot on an IFR check ride, but it's also just great practice. Let's brief an approach together. So here's an approach plate for the RNAV GPS Z runway 31 left at Palm Springs International. Let's brief this approach together. There's a ton of information on there. What matters? What flow should we use? What do I need to remember? So here is how I would think of it as a pilot and also as an applicant on a check ride. First, let's start with the ATIS info. Theoretically, we're in cruise here. We pick up the ATIS. We hear the visibility of the ceiling, temperature, altimeter, runway, and approach in use. And you want to compare that and say, does the approach I have in my hand make sense for the conditions that I just heard on ATIS and for the equipment I have in the airplane? Because not every approach in that approach plate book is usable by every airplane. And certainly not every approach makes sense given the weather conditions. So maybe it sounds obvious, but I always like to take half a second and say, I'm briefing the RNAV Z runway 31 left at Palm Springs. Is that right? Well, yeah, okay. The wind's out of the northwest. The ceiling and visibility are above minimum, so I've got a decent shot of getting in, and I'm equipped to fly this approach. Okay, check. Now that we've done that, we can actually go on and brief the approach. So I like to think of it in these 6 steps. You may have a different approach. There's lots of mnemonics out there. This is kind of how I think of it. So number 1, confirm the approach. So this is both the approach type, the runway, and the airport. So again, sounds obvious, but this is the magic of discipline and doing it the same way every time. We are going to Palm Springs International, right? PSP, correct. That's the right airport. We are flying the RNAV approach. Is that correct? Yes. Sometimes ATC likes to clear you for the ILS. So let's make sure we're briefing the one we are expecting or cleared for. And then let's make sure it's the right runway. Again, some airports can have multiple parallel runways. So make sure we've started with the right approach. Number 2, what is the final approach course? This is one of those big headline numbers. If you can only remember a couple numbers, remember that. The approach course here, and again, approach charts are laid out in pretty systematic way here. So up at the top there, approach course 300. That is in bold for a reason, because when in doubt and we're overloaded, that's the number we need to know that when we are headed towards the missed approach point, 300 is our desired inbound track. Number 3, what's the navigation source? These days, a lot of the time it's GPS. So this may be easier than it once was, where we would have a VOR or an ILS or a localizer or GPS or an NDB. But it's still worth confirming. The big one here is if you fly with a Garmin 430, 530 in particular, that OBS button. If you are actually flying an ILS approach and you've been using GPS the whole trip, don't forget to flip it to VLOC there. That's basically what this step means for me is I'm cleared for the RNAV approach. I'm flying an RNAV approach. That means the avionics I'm looking at need to be saying RNAV. I don't need to have it on ILS or VOR. If you're flying an ILS approach, obviously vice versa, but that's a good check for one of those killer items. You want to make sure you're tracking the correct CDI that's feeding from the correct avionics source. Next, minimums. This is another one of those bold numbers in my head. What's my inbound course? What is my bottom altitude? There's a lot that goes into this, but at the end of the day, if we think we're using the LP approach and we're going to be category A. That means 701. That's 300 feet above the ground. So 700 feet. I want to set that in my G1000. If I've got that, I can set the minimums bug. If I'm steam gauge, I can write it down, or maybe I have a sticky bug on my altimeter. That is a critical number, so make sure you have that in mind. A reminder here on category. I mentioned there in this case, I said, well, it's 701 if we're category A. Here's a reminder on what those categories are, the speeds, 0 to 90 knots for A, 91 to 120 for B. So there's a category your airplane is, quote unquote, certified in based on your approach speed. But the reality here is that doesn't matter. The reality is you should use the category that corresponds to the speed you're going to be flying. So a great example here is on a circling approach. If you're going to approach at 80 knots, but you're going to circle at 95 knots, you should be using category B. It's really about the category you're going to be flying. Don't get worried about what is this airplane's 1.3 times VSO or any of that stuff. It's the speed you're going to be flying. After we think about our minimums, we have to think about what if it goes wrong, the missed approach. I mentioned this earlier. Don't overlook the missed approach that can happen. This has been a nice change over the last 10, 15 years. More and more FAA approach plates, which we're looking at here, have that visual missed approach representation. So you see that in the bottom red box there. I really like that because this says climb to 900, then turn right, climbing turn to 4,000 to this fix. And honestly, beyond that, you can go to the chart. But we need to at least have memorized the first couple things. Climb to 900, then climbing right turn 4,000. That's probably going to get us enough time to look back at the chart. You should definitely check it then with what's at the top of the chart there, which is the textual description there. See if there's any details, see if there's anything that isn't represented down in the graphics. But I like to take one last quick glance at that missed approach graphic down at the bottom because I find that easy to remember. And then finally, emergency. So for me, this means one, just a general sense of, in this case, there's a lot of terrain around. You can see that on the overhead view here. So some sense of that, but that MSA here, what is my safe altitude? 13,000 feet in this case, and that's all quadrants. That's not broken up. So that's 13,000 feet. Importantly, that's within 25 nautical miles of what? MAPCL, the missed approach point. So that's not always necessarily centered on the runway. In this case, that's just if everything goes wrong, what is my bailout altitude? I'm going to get to 13,000 feet, which in this case is extremely high because if you notice, the airport elevation is only 476 feet. So we're going to have to climb a ton. But that's always a good one to have in your mind that if everything goes wrong, that's kind of your get out of jail free card, climb to that altitude. So those are the things I like to look through when I'm briefing an approach. There's a handout here you can access in the GoToWebinar software there. Click on that paperclip and access what we use here in Sporty's Academy in our flight school. There are other things to look at, the facilities, obviously, the runway, what is the lighting, what approach light should I be looking for at the bottom of this? There's a lot to look at, but I think it's worth remembering those critical things. Am I briefing the right approach? What's the inbound course? What's the bottom altitude? What's the missed approach? There are all kinds of mnemonics for this. You'll hear sometimes ICE ATM or ASAP ICE ATM. I'm not a huge mnemonic guy. I think sometimes they confuse more than they simplify, but if you like it, feel free to use one of those as a way to be structured, because that's really the point, is you should have a structured flow that you brief every approach every time. It shouldn't be haphazard. You shouldn't just be randomly going through the approach chart. You should have some type of process to make sure you've covered all the important things. All right, last question here. Question 10. When performing the instrument flight deck check, what indications are you looking for on the flight instruments? Here's one that people overlook a lot. That's kind of why we put it in here. We're not even in the air yet. What am I looking for on those flight instruments? Well, here's how I look at it. I basically walk through in a flow pattern of the instruments on the panel. So we start with the compass. Yes, I don't look at the compass when I fly, but it's required equipment in pretty much every airplane. So you need to check that it moves freely, is full of fluid. I have heard of pilots having incomplete check rides because the compass had no fluid in it. I think that's harsh, but apparently it can happen. So we want to start there. And then we can move down into the six-pack. Airspeed. It should be at 0 when we're on the ground. And we should check that it comes alive during the takeoff roll. So I do this in every airplane. It should be 0 when we're parked in the chocks. And as we roll down the runway, before we have too much speed, I should see that it's alive and accelerating normally. That's a great time to check and make sure we did not leave the pitot tube cover on. Moving across the 6-pack here, attitude, no greater than 5 degrees of bank. Altimeter, you should have it set properly per the ATIS or the AWOS, or barring all of that, field elevation. If you set it with the ATIS or AWOS, should be within 75 feet of field elevation, so it's rarely going to be perfect. But certainly if the field elevation is 500 and your altimeter is saying 800 feet, you probably have a problem, either that you misset it or that your altimeter is going bad. Turn coordinator, it should bank into the turn. So as we taxi around the airport, you should bank. And the inclinometer, or the ball that should swing opposite of the turn. That's a good way to verify that that device is working properly. Heading, it should move freely, so it should turn as we taxi, and it should indicate known headings. You can cross-check this quickly with the compass to make sure that's working. And then vertical speed should be at 0 because we're on the ground. So that seems pretty intuitive. We probably all do a version of this when we taxi out, but it's just a good reminder that the time to find an instrument problem is on the ground before takeoff, not when we're 100 feet in the air in a very precarious position. So there's a lot of these quick checks. It takes about 6 seconds to just run through this and make sure they're doing the right thing. This is a pretty good habit to get into, especially if you jump back and forth between airplanes. It's good to be skeptical and make sure the instruments are all saying what they should be saying. Again, there's a handout here, so you can check that in the GoToWebinar software there. Download the Sporties Academy checklist on how we suggest you do it. And again, there are other things to look at. So maybe on the oral exam, the examiner is not going to want to hear all of these, but I like to do more than just those basics on the flight instruments. Avionics is a huge part of flying IFR these days, so make sure your comm radios are set. If you've got tower in the top of the frequency, you want to have departure in the bottom in the standby so you can quickly switch. You want to make sure that nav source, right, that's GPS VLOC setting is set correctly. You want to have the autopilot set, maybe tested, maybe ready, maybe the flight director's on. It's going to be different in every airplane, but have that set up so that you're not going heads down right away after takeoff to mess with that. Have the altitude selected. Most of us are flying with some type of altitude pre-select these days, even if it's just a G5 like you see here, where you can dial it in. Even if the autopilot's off and you're not going to use it, you can still use that altitude selector. That's a great reminder. So that should be set. If ATC told you climb and maintain 2,500, set that in there. Charts should be ready and accessible, whether that's paper or iPad. Have that ready for the chart you need. So if you do need it, you don't have to go heads down. And then make sure the flight deck's secured. Make sure your passengers are ready. Make sure your flight bag is out of the way. Nothing's blocking the controls, so that you can keep your head up for taxi. Because once we do start moving, we don't want to be heads down programming avionics. You want to be head up, looking out, looking for other airplanes, staying on the center line when you taxi. All right, folks, we did it. 10 questions there in IFR Quiz Hour. Thanks for your attention. Great work. Tried to stump some of you, but you all did a really great job on both the written test questions and the oral exams. Hopefully those questions were helpful for you, maybe knocked off some rust. Again, encourage you to check out Sporties Pilot Training app. If you want to brush up, we have both a full instrument rating course and an instrument proficiency check course there if you already have your rating, but you want to brush up on it. It's a great opportunity to learn something. Also, check out Pilot Workshops, our partners there. Their IFR Mastery, a monthly subscription, is a great service. If you really want to get a monthly, every month, scenario-based, real-world training to keep your IFR skills sharp, I cannot say enough good things about IFR Mastery. It's a terrific product for keeping your currency. You can learn more at pilotworkshops.com. Check out IFR Mastery and give it a shot. Thanks, everybody. We hope to see you again on a Sporties webinar in the near future. And in the meantime, please fly safely.